us. This is the first of our webinar series for 2023. And Imara and I were just having a little shared celebration about that. It's been going on for some time and it seems to be growing. And we're just so appreciative of your support and interest. It's such an important topic each month for us to delve into. And I'm just looking at this little photo I've used all along. I thought about changing it today, but I really love it because of that sun coming up over the horizon. And of course, I'm a rower, so I love the imagery. It's just a little stock photo, but I should research where it actually exists. But it just reminds me of a classic lake in Canada and, you know, a small club, a lot of people carrying a lot of weight, but it becomes lighter when we work on things together. And that's definitely my theme for the year. Hands in, linking arms, and trying to solve some of the challenges that our beautiful, beautiful sports are facing. Welcome to episode 22, Trauma-Informed Safe Sport Practice, Caring for Survivors. And it really is an important topic. I'm so pleased to have our guests. I want to acknowledge the lands that we're on to begin with, because that's part of our philosophy at RRU, to really, truly do the good, hard work of digging into the truth of our past. And even though we may not be responsible for some of the harms inflicted on our Indigenous peoples, we are responsible for trying to build toward reconciliation. And that always starts with truth. So acknowledging the past, the realities that these are unceded territories and that many harms have been experienced by many of the people in our country. We really work at Railroads to learn from the land, learn from systems, learn from what nature has to teach us. And I think this weaves so beautifully into the topic of sport as well, because there's so much to learn from sport. And I know every time I'm in my little skinny boat or in a crew boat with my buddies, I'm being taught something every day, not just through the sport, but by the nature that surrounds me. When I hear those eagles call or watch that cormorant dive, it's always getting me to be grounded and think about the principles that are important as we navigate this world of ours. The bridge I always bring up as well, because that's where I reside at Railroads, is in the School of Communication and Culture. And those two things are inextricably linked. We hear people talking about culture a great deal in sport right now, because culture is values communicated. How well are we living our values, communicating, expressing, and acting the things that we prioritize and hold dear, like safety and health. And we'll talk lots about that today, but bridges can be built only when we understand the different sides, the different perspectives, and whether that's a structure that we're trying to build or shared understanding. It always begins by embracing diversity of perspectives. I also wanted to highlight, because of the topic today in particular of caring for survivors and trying to better inform our practice with that trauma-informed mentality, our model at Railroads really tries to embrace that as well. That caring and community are at the very center of our teaching, our learning, our research. It is a learning-centered university. We're all learning as practitioners, as scholars, as students, as staff, and we're here to help the learning of our communities. I always try to highlight as well the fact that there is truth in sport, to remind us all to lean on our sports. We are experts in our sports. You know, we spend so much time on the water, on the court, on the field, and it has so much to teach us. So when we're feeling stuck and troubled, it sure offers a lot of truths and principles that we can learn from. We know that sport has a great deal of power, I think, because it's one of the most engaging endeavors. We know that it is the most watched, the most participated in, and therefore it has such a powerful platform to inspire positive social change, to inspire people to work together like we know how to in sport, to solve some of these complex challenges we face. Our schools at Railroads, I think, are a beautiful mirror of some of the principles that sport upholds as well, like diversity, inclusion, education, equity, health, peace, development. And we try to acknowledge, we partner with lots of people, but as part of our flexible admission policy, we try to acknowledge the athletes' professional experience, and we count that just like we do with other professional experience as credit into our programs. We partner with many different organizations but I wanted to highlight the two that are sport oriented, like Game Plan, which prepares athletes to transition out of their sport careers into different careers in society, and also organizations like the CFL that really pride themselves on sport leadership, but also On the Podium and different sport organizations across Canada who've invited me to come in and speak and teach leadership development in their organizations as well. So welcome to episode 22, Trauma-Informed Safe Sport Practice. We'll be talking about caring for survivors and asking questions like, how are the survivor-centric challenges associated with each of the phases? How can a supporter help a survivor? How can survivors help improve safe sport processes? And we have three wonderful guests. I'm not sure if Sandra has actually joined us today. I feel she's not available, but that's okay. I will interview her after, but I want to highlight Sandra. She's a fellow rower and Olympian, a professor emeritus at the University of Winnipeg, and founding member of Safe Sport International. And I had the absolute privilege to listen to Sandra speak at a recent symposium put on by SDRCC, the Sport Dispute Resolution Council of Canada. And we all gathered in Toronto, where, you know, she just floored us all with the amount of knowledge and experience that she embodies and shares, and the way that she upholds and supports all other people operating in this space. It was quite remarkable. What a mentor, what a leader, what an idol of mine. We also have Delphine Collin-Vezina, who's a clinical psychologist and director of the Center, sorry, I'm in my own way here a little bit, Center for Research on Children at McGill University. And I met Delphine at that same symposium. And Delphine comes from beyond sport, but of course familiar with sport, but had so many wonderful insights to share with our group of researchers from her perspective. And I'm just so privileged and honored to have her here today. And of course, Erin is coming back. We've seen Erin before and met Erin before, but I love the work Erin's doing across sport. She's a real advocate and activist, and currently the president of AthletesCAN. And I'll get each of our guests to explain a little bit more about what they do, but in the context of my first question, which you're all probably familiar with if you've come to my webinars, I always like to start with asking them to share a bit more about their avenues into sport, why they remain in sport, why they devote their lives to sport, or in Delphine's case, to this idea of trauma-informed practice, so related to sport, especially currently all the cases that we're facing across our sport system in Canada and beyond. I see lots of people participating. Oh, and welcome Isabel, a late joiner, but love to see you here. Lots of people participating in the chat and sharing where they're coming from and what they bring, and keep sharing. We love to see this and get to know you all a little bit better, but please also share your questions in the chat. You could be doing that all the way through the webinar. We don't mind pausing or having a look, or sometimes our guests even respond directly into the chat or find a way to connect after. Go for it. We love seeing your ideas, and your input is important to the learning that we're going through here today. And please share contacts if you're keen to stay connected as well. We'll also try to have a bit of time at the end. We often have some time at the end where we can ask the attendees for some questions. And finally, I just want to highlight some of the contact information where you'll find these people, our guests, on Twitter or via email or in their various locations like U Winnipeg or U of Toronto, where Erin is, and myself, and then highlight a couple of the next topics coming up. And I'd love to hear from people about topics they'd want to hear more about, because I can delve into my network and pull people together for conversations. But these are the two on deck right now. Thank you. And I'll stop and welcome to our guests. And we'll begin by asking you just to share a little bit more about what brought you to sport in the first place, or what, you know, for Delphine, what brought you to SDRCC Research Symposium, where you were invited in to share your perspectives as a clinical practitioner with these group of sport researchers. And, you know, what's your connection? Why do you find yourself still here working in the realm of sport? I mean, I felt I've come full circle. I tried to kind of distance myself and create a different identity for a while, you know, and work with all sorts of organizations, a real range, but continually came back to sport. And now I feel like all I want to do is try to solve some of the problems within sport from a research perspective. Who would like to begin?
certainly jump in.
Thank you, Delphine.
Thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me to this very interesting conversation. As you mentioned, I'm certainly coming as a person external to the sports sector, and I initially chose the path of psychology and specializing in trauma. It was about 25 years ago, and really thinking I wanted to make a difference and to have some social relevance in the work that I was doing. But 25 years ago, we were not talking about abuse in the sports sector. It was very unspoken about. It was taboo. There were no kind of high-profile cases in the media. And so I did work in the field of child protection, because that's certainly where there was a great deal of needs for children and youth who were identified as having been exposed to child maltreatment in their lives. And then eventually, with my expertise growing, kind of extending, I was approached by the Catholic Church, so another external group, not a group that I'm particularly connected with, but they were seeking my expertise to help them deal with kind of cases of sexual abuse, especially that were coming up. And as you know, because it's certainly very well featured in the media, that there's a lot of attention given to these old cases and more recent cases as well, and the need to speak about abuse happening in these institutions. So I guess that this is how I was approached, to also bring that expertise I have, thinking about how we can best respond to the needs of children and youth and adults who are exposed to traumatic experiences, but from an institutional perspective, that it's no longer just an individual matter, it's a social responsibility. It's every one of us responsibility. And this is probably why I decided that, although I don't know that much about the sports sector, aside from just enjoying it for myself in my personal life, that I thought it was such an interesting sector also to be joining in this conversation and trying to build bridges. So thank you again.
Thank you. And I'll pick the threads up later around the parallels between institutions that you see. And I love your point about we're all responsible. I'd like to dig into responsibility a little more, and this idea of child protection. But recently, I can't remember why I posted it, but something about I'm really realizing that no matter who you are in sport or in any of these kind of institutional settings, whether you're a child or not, you're in this power imbalance. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more as well, and really vulnerable. And I've heard athletes say, I'm vulnerable for my passion. I care so much, and therefore I'm much more vulnerable because I'll take more risks, I'll sacrifice more, I'll compromise more because I'm protecting this thing I love so much. Yeah, difficult. And the taboo as well, I've jotted down what makes abuse taboo to talk about. Very interesting to be curious about that. And Erin, how about you? What's drawn you to sport? What's your connection?
Yeah, absolutely. My draw to sport is I've been an athlete my whole life. I think I was a very active child. I started my sport of synchronized swimming at 10 years old. And so I've always kind of had a love for that. And I have to say my childhood in sport was amazing. I met so many great friends that are still my friends to this day. It was the thing I looked forward to every day. It was the reason it gave me a passion at a young age. And there was so much of my life that I'm grateful for because I was in sport. The more high up I got, the more challenges I faced, particularly when I was on Team Canada. There was just a lot of abuse that did happen. And I was on Team Canada from 2007 till 2013. I was part of the 2012 Olympic Games for Team Canada. And there wasn't the language at that time of understanding my experiences. A lot of people around me were experiencing the same thing. It was very normalized, particularly on the national team. We were very isolated. So I didn't really know much different. I just know how it made me feel. And during that time when I'm supposed to be representing Team Canada and being seen as the best in the world, I was at my worst mentally because of the experiences and the emotional abuse I was experiencing. I've never felt worse about my time myself when I was competing at the Olympics, which I think is a really heartbreaking way to feel. And so I tried to distance myself a little bit from sport for a little bit, but really, within a couple of years, I just missed sport, and not necessarily my sport, but sport in general. So it brought me to an undergraduate degree in kinesiology, and then found a master's program that was looking at abuse in sport with Dr. Gutschenkurt. And I jokingly say the first year I did it, I thought it was just going to be for me to process my own experiences, because it was the first time I'd ever heard it be called abuse. And then that's quickly grown into a 6-year graduate program of my master's and my PhD, because I quickly realized that no, this isn't something that I personally experience. This is something that happens across sports. And I've talked to so many athletes from summer sports, winter sports, team sports, individual sports all around the world in Canada who are all experiencing the same thing. And it just is so sad for me that all of these athletes, who don't talk to each other and don't know each other, have that same experience and those same common themes that they're experiencing. And so it's really driven my passion into this work. And while I started more on the academic side doing the research, it's really translated into more of a practical thing, really focusing on advocacy. So I've been on the board of AthletesCAN. This is my 3rd year on the board, and this is my 2nd year as president. And AthletesCAN is the association for national team athletes, where we are the formalized voice within Sport Canada to represent national team athletes. So this is everything from safe sport issues to governance issues to athlete representation issues. We just try to make sure that athletes have a formal voice in a system that is meant to be for them, and trying to just make sure that their rights are respected and upheld. So that's kind of my journey here today.
Yes, and I've been following you, of course, your journey, your career, very, very, just so inspiring, I think, to so many athletes, but to all of us, that you're working so hard for positive change and caring. And I think we often do, right? We carry this love for the sport, and it keeps us going. I'd like to pick up on your thread too around representation and the process. I know AthletesCAN has been involved in some of the development around safe sport policy in Canada, and love to hear more about that. And you also mentioned, as you climbed in the intensity of performance, right, toward high performance, toward the Olympics, that the abuse actually gets worse, so the experience becomes more. And that's an interesting one for us to pull on, I think, to try to understand better and discuss and get input from others. All right. Now, before I shared a bunch of questions beforehand, and I always like to just catch you off guard with something new that occurs to me beforehand. But I just also wanted to highlight that I met both Delphine and Erin in Toronto recently, and Sandra, where we came together and shared our findings. There were 10 studies that were conducted. And it was so encouraging to me that this work is being done, that it's being shared, that this community of people linking arms, so we're not isolated or feeling like we're working in isolation and alone. It was very powerful for me to see and to make all those connections. I wonder if you could just highlight a bit about what you shared. You both were, along with Sandra, we're talking about the position of survivor groups. That was Sandra. Delphine talked about survivor-centric complaint processes in non-sport sectors. And then Erin was working with Margot on the support programs for survivors. Would you mind sharing a bit of the insights you gained through those projects, or even comments you have about that research symposium that you came away with? Delphine, do you mind sharing? Thanks.
Well, it's just going back to the idea that, a few years ago, that was not spoken about. It was very heartwarming to see so many people coming together, different projects, and that it was taken from within, that it was the institution again, kind of trying, and sport institutions who were trying to bring some leadership, and not just individual people trying to speak up and get the attention on this kind of social issue. So it was really great to see this synergy that was created by so many different people and different projects, and sport institutions who were really spearheading initiative. So very heartwarming. And in terms of my project in particular, because I'm not from the sports sector, I really wanted to just highlight some of the key principles when it comes to listening to victims, to supporting them through this healing journey. What are the key ingredients for victims to feel that they're heard, then they're believed, and how we can infuse trauma-informed care principles in everything that we do. And I will just provide just one last comment, is that I think it's, again, not something that only specialized people can learn how to do, because if we're waiting for people to find the right therapist that they can talk to, it might take a long time. And many people will turn to a friend, a family member, someone they know in their surrounding, and particularly in a sports sector where people are very much performing in a group setting and meeting different people. That means that they're very likely to disclose to a non-professional individual, and how everyone can feel better equipped to receive the disclosure is really key. So I hope that this is what was coming across as part of that, that project that I was part of.
And would you mind just sharing a little more about, well, what are we talking about when we say trauma-informed? I think that's one of the key pieces to equipping anyone with at least a few key ingredients to be able to support.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about a trauma-informed care perspective, what we mean is that we're coming from a place of acknowledging that trauma is in our society. It's very disturbing to think about that. We want to avoid thinking about abuse and trauma because it's just, those are horrific stories, and it's very easy just to put them aside. So it's coming from a place of acknowledging, recognizing that people who are going through traumatic experiences, it's difficult for them to tell. It's very likely that they will be impacted by the experience, and that we need individually and collectively to reach out to them and offer support. And that it's this kind of idea, that lens that we're using when doing any kind of work with any kind of population. Unfortunately, trauma is very prevalent in the general population and also in the sports sector. So coming from a place of people telling the truth and being in need of receiving great support from any of us.
And you spoke of listening, and what does that look like? How do we kind of position ourselves to listen in a trauma-informed way?
Well, it's first and foremost to think that someone who's coming to you and start talking about potentially abusive situation, it takes more than courage. Like it's just amazing how many resources this person needs to take in order to be able to have this conversation. It may have taken sometimes weeks, months, years for that person to find like a little bit of courage inside and trust in others to think, okay, I'm going to tell that person in particular. So we're not usually prepared. Maybe it comes as a surprise, but we need to be able to put everything else on the side and be able to focus to what that person is telling us today, because this may have been a process that has been kind of, they're preparing for that talk. And so we need to be able to be very receptive. The other piece is that we need to believe the person to start with. It's hard because it might be someone, the person is talking about behaviors that may have been done by people we trust, we have great esteem for. So that's a hard position to be in, but it's to have this position of trust and belief to start with. Unless you're the person doing the inquiry, you're not being asked to say whether it's true, completely true. Like, you don't have to do that. And not that many people do come up with false accusations. And so we need to believe. And then it's to listen. The person is not there to find a quick solution. It's to just receive a very empathetic response of, wow, that must have been difficult for you. I'm so sorry to hear what you've gone through. To be able just to be heard and believed, it can make a huge difference for that person. And we know that initial reaction of that first person that is receiving the disclosure is going to make an influence on how likely the person is going to talk more about the abuse, maybe go seek more professional help or report to the authorities. So it's the beginning of a journey, and that very initial reaction can make an enormous impact in a person's life. Even if you're not a professional, you're not giving any professional advice, but welcoming the disclosure and feeling kind of just empathetic to what is being said is sometimes really enough for many victims, as a starting point, at least.
Thank you. It's such a useful piece of advice to simply be open and receptive and set things aside. And even if you question and you know, that person I trust, I love, I can't believe you're saying it, you know, just keep that and be receptive and open. Great advice. And then that idea that they can make all the difference for the person going forward.
Yeah.
And then can help them follow a more kind of formal process. Yeah, love it, which is good for everyone, I think, in the end. Although we'll talk more about that, some of the flaws. And Erin, can you share some of the things that you were sharing with Margot at the symposium around support programs?
Absolutely. And I first want to say, so the SDRC did a really good job of trying to ensure that there is a research-informed approach with it, which I think is really important. I think one of the things I was struck by is that while we continually are hearing stories about how Canadian sport is going through a lot of problems, or at least these problems are bubbling to the surface, we actually have a really big network of researchers and practitioners in this area who have been studying this for a long time. And I think this is something that was really important because the past kind of 12 months, 24 months have really been marked by stories of athletes sharing their experiences. And this topic has become really popular in the past couple of years, but there's so many researchers who have been doing this work for a very long time. And we are in some ways lucky to have the resources available from people like Sylvie Perrant, who is a great researcher in Quebec. And there's a lot of other researchers we can name. I continually reference their work and just note that the things that they were saying 10, 15 years ago are things that we're unfortunately only really taking seriously now. And so I think while it is really hard to hear all the stories that are coming out, we are very lucky to have the resources that we do, both within sport and in Delphine's case out of sport, and the similarities that were found. I think something I was really struck by was Delphine, who wasn't from sport, was able to identify a lot of the same issues that we're dealing with. And so I think this exceptionality that sport is different in some ways is really, unfortunately, not true. While there are some nuances to sport, like the power differentials, it's not only sport exclusive, and that we do have a lot of resources available. So that was something that I was really struck by in this meeting that we had in the fall. So in terms of the work that I did, both with Margot Mountjoy and with Dr. Kerr, because I was working on 2 different reports with them, is just the experiences of disclosure and reporting, and particularly the barriers to reporting maltreatment for athletes. The 2 biggest barriers that we identified were, one, the normalization of so many abusive and neglectful behaviors, especially emotional abuse in sport is completely normalized in a lot of circumstances. Being yelled at, being told you're not good enough, being completely diminished. These are all things that probably every athlete can have said to experience. When we did our study in 2019, looking at the experiences of national team athletes, 75% of athletes experience emotional abuse, which is a staggering number, and something that we need to talk about. And especially more staggering is when we asked them what their experience of reporting was, that number dropped to about 10 to 15%. And so again, just showing how how it's been so internalized within the sport culture that these things are acceptable. And you see it every, Sunday and watching football, you see how the coaches react. You see how this win at all cost mentality has really perpetuated within all sport. So that was kind of the first reason that we identified as the barrier. The second is the fear of repercussions, both personal and professional. So what is this going to mean for an athlete who shares their experience? What are the safeguards around being protected? Because if that information goes back to your coach, that's your career on the line. That's everything that you've worked for. And it's not just your career, it's your life. I started swimming at 10 years old. I didn't go to Olympics till I was 24. That's 14 years that I had to think about every time I thought about speaking up about my experience, or trying to not even speak up, but like try to pursue any actions, because I know that would have meant that I was the one being vulnerable in that situation, and I did not have protection at that time to feel comfortable enough to speak out. And that's what we hear from a lot of athletes, is particularly current athletes. And I think this is one of the reasons we see a lot of more retired athletes speak out about their experiences, is because they don't have that thing to lose, but oftentimes it's too late by the time they get to that point. So those are kind of the two biggest things that we noticed, and that kind of similar to what Delphine was saying earlier. Athletes speaking about this have often been dismissed. So again, we at U of T did a report in 2019 of 1,000 athletes' experiences of abuse, and the large reaction in the Canadian sport was a lot of dismissal. Oh, that's just a bunch of squeaky wheels. Those are people with axes to grind. It's not everyone. It's just a small amount of like loud people. Or, athletes are just trying to weaponize that they didn't make the team, and like safe sports seems to be the word to use. And so it was continually dismissed time and time again. I think this is kind of 2022 was the first year that people started to really acknowledge that this was occurring at the levels that we've been trying to sound the alarm bells on. And so I think looking forward, we have a few recommendations. So making sure that there is both physical and emotional safety through the reporting process, kind of to deal with what we were talking about, really emphasizing the trust and transparency of the reporting mechanism. So making sure that athletes feel comfortable with what their options, and trusting the system that's been built for them. We recognize that there is a lot of mistrust within athletes right now. So making sure that those processes are rebuilt and that trust is rebuilt, and it's going to take a long time to be able to do. Making sure that all stakeholders are involved. So making sure we have as much collaboration as possible, which again is one of the reasons I'm really happy to have Delphine as part of these conversations, and people who are looking from the outside in. Sorry, I feel like I could go on forever, but I think those are kind of my main findings that we were talking about when we were talking with SDRCC, but really just understanding that, similar to Delphine, that athletes are listened to, that they have a place where they can feel safe and confident in sharing their experiences if they choose to, which again is part of the trauma-informed care that I think we're going to get into, is that maybe not every athlete needs to share their experience if they don't want to, and they shouldn't be pressured to share it if that's not their journey. And I think there's a lot of ways that stories are very important, they're very impactful, but you also have to recognize that every athlete is in their own part of their healing journey, which may or may not include speaking out about their experience.
Yeah, I love that point, that stories are very important, but as you can see, often they're still dismissed. And so what are some, I'm just pulling on a thread here a little bit with you, Erin, what are some avenues that seem to actually awaken, help people believe, help people, we rely on numbers. I see that in gymnastics, I saw in your study, 1,000 athletes. But that doesn't always seem to make a difference either. What do you think is making a difference in awakening this reception to the reality of abuse in sport?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure I think it's a accumulation of things that are happening. I think obviously numbers are important, but it's also numbers aren't always personal. And so there's, again, like hearing those stories can help. But I think it's a combination of all of these things. And I think we did one study in Canada, but there's also a very similar study that was done through the US Olympic Committee. There's quite a few being done in Europe. all, even though it's different levels of sport, different age groups, different categories, all of them have the same numbers. And so I think at this point, like the numbers should speak to themselves, but I think there is that like that you need the emotion too. And there, it is an emotional topic. And so I think just kind of having both the numbers and just like every other week last year, there was a new sport coming out about their experiences. And I think it's just like, it became hard to ignore. But I don't know if I have an answer of like what it was or what it can be.
Yeah.
That's going to make people understand that this is an everyone problem.
Mhm. I can certainly say that it's also part of a shift in culture in many societies, and a different way of thinking about children, adolescents, and vulnerable people. What is a vulnerable people? Thinking about you may not be vulnerable overall in your life and having great success and capacities, and but you might be vulnerable in one relationship because of power dynamics. So we've come to realize gradually that we had to shift the way we were thinking about the people that might be subjected to abuse, the people that are also abusers. For very long, for those like me who, are more in their 40s and above, we probably got some prevention programs that were telling us about, the stranger, and, make sure that you stay away from the stranger who's going to want to show a little dog, or will want to give you some candies and so forth. So that perspective of a stranger as the perpetrator also eventually evolved because of the kind of studies that Erin was involved in later on in sports sectors, but that happened in the general population in the first place, showing that this is kind of an inaccurate portrayal of what is really happening out there. And it's not to say that it doesn't happen, not at all. But when we think that 9 out of 10 people know their perpetrator when it comes to thinking about sexual abuse in the general population, it means that the stranger person waiting in the bush is not necessarily the most common experience that people have. So I think that those studies, they have helped eventually shape a different picture of this reality, and forcing people to recognize that even though it's reassuring to think that it's only the stranger in the bush kind of idea, that for most people, they know the person who's abusing, they have a trust relationship. It's very complex. And so it's through all that knowledge that was reshaping the way that we perceive maltreatment and abusive situations and violence in general.
I would say one more thing to add on that is just this understanding of culture and how much things have changed. A lot of things that were acceptable 10 or 20 years ago, just in our culture, in our society, are not acceptable now. And I think people, we've seen this through Black Lives Matter, we've seen this with the Me Too movement. There's a lot of things that people are calling out to recognize that these are actually not okay, even though they were very much ingrained within our system. And I think child development and the way athletes are coached, that has really changed too. We see in every other sector there being a really child-centered approach, like more hands-on learning. It's not about punishment anymore. It's not about kind of that dictatorship model anymore. It's really changed to collaborative learning and an athlete-centered approach. And there's so much research that's been done on the benefits of using athlete-centered coaching and positive coaching techniques to provide a better outcome. And so when you look at that from a child development perspective, there is a just shift of how are we getting the best out of athletes? And there was a lot of, in gymnastics, for example, in the 90s, it was a very different coaching style, and that was idolized, and everyone kind of went for that Eastern European kind of model of discipline and control, whereas that's not really working anymore. And so I think we're seeing a shift of culture and understanding what tools and techniques as coaches work best for athletes to elicit the best performance, the most long-term performance, and then also how we're defining success in sport. Is it just about the medals, or is it also about making sure that they're complete humans, making sure that they're set up for success post post-sport, which often will end between 16 and 24 for a lot of athletes. And so just understanding that there's a big cultural shift that's started to happen, but will need to continue to happen, that really starts to make people recognize that and reflect on a lot of the behaviors that are going on right now.
Some great comments in the chat, and I'm getting there, I'm seeing them. So I will definitely work our way through this idea of we're all learning together. Culturally, we're understanding abuse more effectively, we're understanding relationship, power, our environment, how culture actually takes place or is enacted, learning so much more about sport. Love the point too, that sport is so much more than striving and achievement, which is wonderful, but there are these other elements that it has so much to teach us and give our world. And can we better leverage that? So yes, strive to be the best you can ever be, but also be a leader and develop all the abilities that sport can offer us to learn. But it depends on great coaching and education. The intersectionality, we're also realizing, right, and starting to see the intersection of concerns from many different sectors, populations. That was actually raised at our symposium as well, that we're seeing the parallels, we're seeing it between different institutional cases, like the church and sport, right? We're starting to see that, oh, the principles are in parallel. So that's been very helpful. And then to this point about, okay, so people are doing research on this and trying to bring the learning forward. So there we were in our symposium. Are we doing enough, Abby asks, to move our research beyond the halls of academia? And actually, before we all joined, Erin and I were chatting about how do you make the research more accessible and practical? And there are definite ways we try to focus on that, Rural Roads. But what can we do as academics, because we all are, to move our research beyond the halls of academia, that ivory tower, the shelf, into something more practical? I know things are happening. You're both doing good things in this area, but can you share?
Well, it's true that I think that people in academia for a very long time, they were just in their, ivory tower and not sharing and keeping their privileges and kind of doing their research on their own and not really caring about how relevant, their research was. There's a shift in culture here as well, I would say, that I've seen over the years. And there are many people in academia who are hoping to make a real difference and not for their research to be just on the shelf and not having any kind of impact socially. It's a requirement now also from funding bodies. I have to say there's a push really. To me, myself, it's always been something I had at the forefront of my career. I collaborate with, school settings, child protection, health and social services, different sectors to make sure that we do some different workshops and activities and different ways to make sure that this knowledge is being applied and that it's useful also. And I would say that it's not only that direction, it goes both. It's a very iterative process. I learn a great deal from, the expertise of the people that I speak with, and then that informs my own research. And I really love this collaborative approach. And I know in the comments about kind of being for or against, national inquiries, I'm really not very much in the know in terms of the national inquiries in your field, but I did collaborate and testified in different sessions and different moments at the policy level, and to try to make sure that as a person in academia that I could also support any initiatives. I care about providing a space for victims to be heard, and that any route that I find, I will certainly use it. But thank you for your question, because it's true that we cannot just remain like outsiders and not go in the field and be a real collaborator with others that are doing the work.
Yes, and it's wonderful to see the media picking up and leveraging the research, right? So bringing it to the public through that platform, and people sharing more on various platforms we have. So it's a good point. And Abby's second question that Delphine pointed to, and I think Erin has some insight on this as well. So why would, because there has been a brief submitted to the status of women in the committee that's exploring these topics, why would academics who are funded publicly by Sport Canada, CAC, STRCC, why would anyone be against a national inquiry? Because there's a huge push for a national inquiry into safe sport in Canada as one avenue. Why would there be a resistance to that? Comments on that? Erin, do you have any?
I'm sorry, Jennifer, I was caught up by a comment in the chat that was about, how much sometimes there were some people in academia that it's not because they didn't want to share, but it was largely ignored. It took time. And so I wanted to acknowledge that there's some people that were really pioneers in that field. And I feel fortunate that I can walk in their path in academia. So sorry. So this is why I was kind of that was that message I wanted to address and acknowledge. So thanks, Laura, for stating that.
Yes, thank you. And I know, I've read some briefs and I understand both sides, and I see that to Erin's point earlier, so much research has been done for years. I mean, Sandra spoke eloquently to that in our symposium. And if you look back, some of the first research done in the world was done in Canada on abuse in sport. So it's 30, 40 years old. And so we know it's there. I know one time I tried to run a survey and someone said, that's been done already. And that's what we can fall into, that trap of trying to ask questions again. I had recently working with an NSO, they're like, well, we want to do another review. And I thought, well, you already have all these reviews. Like, just really pay attention to the data that's been gathered so far. So I could see that being an argument against another inquiry, although we also know the Dublin inquiry worked very well to change sport, and Canada was a real leader in that, kind of a scapegoat, I think, as well, but a real leader in changing doping, approaches to doping in sport. So there can be real advantages. And I think it's a discussion to keep having, and it's one of those bridges where we try to understand diverse perspectives. Yeah, here's Laura saying, giving Sandra Kirby credit here in 1996. Some of the first work done around safe sport was in the 90s, but even the 80s with Lenski as well, right? Thank you. And I want to highlight too, I attended another conference with mediators and adjudicators, and they invited survivors to speak and tell their stories. And I wondered about your perspectives on that technique of involving the survivors in at least the understanding, perhaps the shaping of policy and procedure going forward. What do you think about that? I was there. I think it was, there were advantages and positives, but I also worried about it. What do you think? Erin?
I can start, but I would love to know Delphine's perspective as well. I think it really depends on where the athlete is in their journey. I think that you have to respect that some athletes are comfortable sharing their story, and there's some athletes that aren't, or they're comfortable saying it one time and not. Like Alison Forsyth, who's another very big advocate in this field, she does share her story, and she's been sharing her story for years because she wants people to understand that's happening. But talking to her behind closed doors, every time she talks about it, that she is re-traumatized by that experience. And so understanding from a trauma-informed perspective, it really, really depends on the athlete. And also from a trauma-informed perspective, ensuring that everyone who's listening is prepared to listen to that and prepared to take in that information. And while stories are absolutely so impactful, and again, any athlete who wants to share their experience publicly, privately, anything, I encourage anyone to share their experiences if that is what they so choose to do. It is a very heavy topic, and it comes with a lot of complication. It comes with a lot of triggers. So just making sure that any area where there are these conversations happening, making sure that there are a lot of protections involved for everyone who's hearing the story, listening to the story. And so I think that there is a impact that it can have. But again, just questioning why is the story being shared? Who is the story being shared to? What are the effects for all participants involved? I think there's a lot of questions. And again, what can we do to move forward from the conversations as well? And I think that this is something that can be really difficult, is I don't know, in the nice, like in the most real way possible, like what we need to move also, like it can't just be us listening, but what are we going to do to move forward? And where are we taking the next steps? And if we're still continually in a loop of we're hearing stories and we're hearing stories and we're hearing stories and nothing's being done about it, that's frustrating for people who are listening. It's frustrating for the athlete that's involved, or the person who experienced trauma involved. If I'm just hearing if I'm just, the person who's being paid to tell my story over and over again, and it's 3 years down the line and you're hearing that same story, it just gets frustrating after a while. Especially when we look at the culture that we're in and how it's so many athletes experience almost the exact same thing regardless of their experience. What else can we do to help this conversation?
Right. We have more comments in the chat about the pressure this can exert and actually lead to real change when there's a call for an investigation or an exploration or an inquiry. The repetition without follow-up, without action can be so frustrating, and it's so re-traumatizing. I mean, we see it with so many going through the process, which leads me to this question around the process and how do we build trust in the system that's built for this. This safe sport claim has so many phases. Delphine spoke about disclosure, and that's not even part of that formal process necessarily. It often occurs with someone they trust. It's very informal. It can be surprising. And then maybe reporting. Then there's an assessment, which is a difficult little step. Mediation, perhaps. Investigation, perhaps. There's discipline and sanctioning, and all along that process can take many, many months or years even. What's your perspective on that process? As I watch us work in Canada to try to, enhance it, improve it, it almost seems to be getting more complex. And that seems to be the response from many small clubs on the ground as well. How do we even navigate this? Comments on the system, the process as it is right now, and as we're moving to enhance or improve it. What are you noticing?
I certainly don't know in great details how the system works in sport, but I can maybe comment seeing how the Catholic Church was trying to kind of come up with a system that made sense. And I think that and they're far. I don't want to present that as if they found the perfect solution to what we're discussing today. I certainly don't want to portray, the institution as having found the right way to do it, but they're certainly in process, or some of them are in process. What is frustrating, and me coming in, was to really have a sense that they wanted to keep a hold on an internal process. Like they wanted to have something internal happening first before kind of getting it involving the authorities, involving a third party, involving anyone who could criticize or maybe could take different actions that they would disagree with. And I don't know what's the stage in terms of when I hear that there's kind of multiple layers and there's multiple reports, including some within the kind of institution and then involving the authorities. I think this is what we did, especially with the Archdiocese of Montreal, but wanting to kind of really revisit completely that from the victim perspective. At least there was not many times they needed to talk about the abusive situation. This is because, as Erin was mentioning, it can be empowering for people to speak up about what they've experienced later on in their healing journey. But it can be re-traumatizing, sorry. Even when people have come a long way, and it can be very difficult. So thinking about the person who's just at the very beginning of that disclosure process, having to tell many people, can be extremely taxing and emotionally overwhelming. And so we want to avoid that. But also when we have an internal process, from the victim's perspective, we need to be very careful because it might look as if we want to deal it from within and kind of not get the word out that there's something wrong happening here. And we want, so the taboo continues. And this is what happened to many victims, is that they were silenced. And when they decide to speak up, the institution at least must show a great deal of transparency and show courage, because they did show courage in speaking up. And so how the institution can also align in taking steps, sometimes that are super difficult, but by involving a third party, and maybe it will go out and maybe it will make a big deal out, there will be a big deal out of it, but that's the reality. And that courage is essential, I think, for victims to believe in the institution and in the system that is there to protect them.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Just again, going back to that trauma-informed approach, making sure that the people that are using the system are involved in all parts of the system, not necessarily the victim themselves, but other athletes that could potentially use that or have experienced trauma in the past if they so desire. Just making sure that the system is built, again, in this case for athletes, but for all victims of abuse in sport, and making sure that they're part of all this process. The OSIC is brand new, and there are a lot of things that are not perfect about it yet. But the more that they can rely on athletes' feedback and their input, I think that's really important, is to make sure that there's constantly checks and balances, and making sure, on one hand, it is a complicated process. Investigating an instance of abuse is complicated, but it's kind of like using an app on your phone. There can be a lot of things going on in the background, but from the user's perspective, like, what is the user looking at and what are they experiencing, and how can we make it easier for them to be able to use the app on their phone? They don't really care about all of the things that are going on in the background. Doesn't mean that they don't occur, but how can it be easiest for me as someone who is going through this process? So I think it's really kind of two different things. Of it's going to be complicated, but I think the more you can have the end user involved in the experience and involved in the development, and I think there's some progress that's being made. I think there's a lot more that's needed to be done. I think one of the examples that I can think of off the top of my head is the name abuse-free sport. That wasn't something that was ever consulted on by athletes. That's not what athletes wanted as the name of this system. And so even small things like that, it makes it difficult for athletes to feel like they're trusting in a system that they can't even be involved in. So I think just encouraging them to continue to listen to athletes and not that only athletes experience abuse. And I know the system is set up for all victims of abuse in sport, but just making sure that's really going to be set up and there for the end user.
Brilliant insight of end user. And I think, so many people are trying to figure it all out, but we're demonstrating that we're learning as we're doing it, aren't we? Because we're showing them all the stuff in the background, this is what's going on, instead of it thinking about that end user. And this is where I think the other little piece that needs to be brought in is that organizational piece. How does communication work? How does culture work? People need to be consulted on names. Name and language is so crucial. The process is very legal. It probably privileges, it's about fairness, really. So that's being kind of taken care of, but are we taking care of this other aspect of trauma and how hard it is to have to speak the story if you've experienced abuse? So trying to bring that in more, and love just seeing everybody pushing for that harder, exploring all sorts of options and ideas, and really encouraging people to that collaborative learning. We need to also be very collaborative in that learning, looking for opportunities. What do you think is missing in the process? What else is missing in the process right now? That simplification where it's like a user focused for everybody involved, the trauma informed. What about supports along the way for people? Is there enough support if people try to go down this process and solve a problem of an abusive situation or scenario or environment? What do you think? How important is that? What could that look like?
I think it's extremely important. And I'm not sure, again, there's, as even as someone who's been kind of more involved in the process than the general public, I think I don't know all the ins and outs of what it means to what the support is looking like. So I definitely would encourage there to be support too. But I think when we talk about what's missing, it's the preventative aspect, I think, is the biggest one. And that's something we haven't really touched on. And I'm sure that was one of your questions a little later down, but understanding that, like, while the OSIC is existing, there's a lot that needs to be done so that it's not just a policing system. We need to make sure that we are focusing on changing the culture, making sure that there's education, making sure that education not only on what is wrong. And I think there was a comment earlier on, like, can we have the behaviors that are wrong? And I think that's absolutely important to know. And there is a universal code of conduct that, again, from a user's perspective, is very legalese and difficult for coaches who are just trying to understand what good looks like. And I think there's also a huge gap in understanding what behaviors are acceptable and what does acceptable coaching look like and what is an acceptable culture and like a positive culture and all of those kinds of aspects that we're missing too. Of right now, there are a lot of coaches, for good reason, that are just very scared because they've never been taught differently. This is how the standard of coaching has been. Whether that's right or wrong can be debated at another time, but I think we do recognize that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to educate everyone on what a good environment looks like, and that's really missing at this time.
Yeah, and especially increasingly, I find there's a focus on, fostering best practices. How do we create these environments? What do they look like? But you highlight a really important point too about the irony of the fear that safe sport is creating, right? That people are afraid of being accused and on tenterhooks around that. And what if I do something wrong? And so being really clear about good practice as well as what to avoid. But I had a wonderful conversation with a good friend of mine around when does it tip into bullying? And she described when drop and do 20 when you're late. And this is there was a recent article about athletes ending up in the hospital because of that kind of sport as punishment. And I think it is really just avoiding sport as punishment, first of all, but also watching that drop and do 20 start as something kind of funny and then tip into something rather ugly quite quickly. And his conclusion was, it's when you're pushing out instead of pulling in. A beautiful illustration of if someone, isn't quite getting it, or they're late, or they don't, understand some rule, pull them in, So I'm late for practice. Well, what could you do to rebuild to, that restitution concept? Quite gorgeous. More of that, right? How do we bring more of all that into sport? And I find it really healing personally to shift my focus to the what could be and away from the challenges that so many are facing. Okay. What about
if I can add just something on that note, it's what we find in other settings when it comes to infusing trauma-informed care principles and practices. So in school settings, child protection, other settings, is that providing just a one-time training is not going to do much. This is and it's probably likely to happen, thinking of, the example Erin was providing, like coaches, they might be aware that there's a culture shift, that there are things that they need to change, not feeling equipped. And here we're not talking about, situations of maltreatment and violence and abuse, because as it was mentioned in the chat, of course, there were things that were happening before, and people were feeling absolutely uncomfortable and not well with those situations and hurt, and they just didn't have a place to speak up. But we're thinking about the coaches who know that, their techniques are probably not in keeping with the changes to interact and build rapport with athletes, and how much they need to be accompanied. It's a scaffolding process, because you change your perspective and sometimes even your values. What is needed to bring somebody, to that level and then to that super expert level? They probably have some really a mind view of what is needed for athletes to achieve their top capacities. So it's not just about learning the skills, it's sometimes to revisit some of your really core values in life and that doesn't, it won't change just with a 1 hour training or even a day or even a week. It's about being scaffolded and supported through that change. And sometimes this is what I see being missed. We offer training sessions thinking that it's going to solve everything, and it doesn't change really how people behave. It might change how people think, but it doesn't change the behaviors.
Yeah, I'm loving seeing a number of people, mostly mental performance consultants or mental health practitioners who've been engaged in offering that kind of training across sport organizations. And I think that's a great step in the right direction. Thank you. People are helping in the chat very much. I'm like, I want to chat, but I also need to ask questions. The rule of two. So the rule of two is an interesting one. It's something that's been brought in to try to keep things transparent. And yet we see with Nasser, where the parent was in the room, right, when he was abusing young women, or where it's happening in front of people, and the bystander issue, right? So where do we go with that? What could we do? And one of our attendees has pointed out that a rule of two can be problematic. It actually just gave access to two priests, so we're learning, right? We're learning how can we adjust that a little more? What do we mean by transparency, or what are some examples of transparency that you've seen work really well?
And it's there are many things happening on the chat as well, right? And so kind of keeping my attention there as well to this great conversation and people speaking up and taking, the space to say what they've gone through or what they've observed, and the frustration. This is what I get from, the chat also, in terms of the frustration of sometimes seeing that, the institution is not doing enough or protecting itself. And I think this is, certainly something that we can see across many different sectors, people being hurt and wanting changes to happen fast. And I'm the first person to be always encouraging anyone kind of to just speak their mind in terms of how frustrating that process is. But what I see in other settings is that it takes time, and many people, we need to come together. And one encouraging things is to see that we're 62 people together today, and with many more people will be listening to that podcast afterwards. And although it's not a solution in itself, but it shows that there's something that is shifting. And I hope that, even though it's not a perfect solution to the frustration that I can, read in some of the comments, that it's at least a hopeful message that there's something happening.
Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge, right, the frustration, and perhaps there's a space for a forum in which some of these questions, they're here today, which is great, and I'm happy to provide the forum where we can surface some of that frustration and ask questions. But maybe now we need to move forward to ask for a forum where this can be confronted, because there are many people calling for some change in a certain way, certain ways, whether independence comes up a lot, truly independent and external. Stop policing ourselves has come up often. There's this sense that sport's exceptional and therefore we can, but how do we, make that shift? And also a forum, though, to discuss, well, why isn't a judicial inquiry happening right now? I don't know that I've seen that discussion yet. And I think it's probably time, because it's definitely starting to peak as a point of frustration for people. And I think, again, all the perspectives should be heard. Prevention, yes, is definitely another topic we want to dive a little bit more into. And one thing that one of the women that I worked with suggested was, what about simulations, like going through in our learning process of designing a process of both prevention and addressing abuse when it happens. What about going through a simulation so that we can imagine how things can work instead of just implementing and seeing how it works? Because, we're dealing with human beings when we do that. other practices that you think are showing, that they're really being productive and having a positive impact? I do like the UCCMS has explicated some of what abuse looks like, which I think is helpful, but it's very legalese, as Erin said. Delphine.
Now, I just wanted to re-emphasize something that Erin pointed out, that is the necessity to involve victim survivors in that process. And that's, for me, is key, to hear from individuals with lived experience, but to collaborate with them, not just to review what we've come up with as experts, like this kind of approach, but to have a real community that is thinking, for instance, about simulation, training, anything, but inviting them from the very beginning to be part of co-constructing anything that is, any policy and initiative. I think that what I see, at least in my work, is that it's very popular to see that we will seek, the perspective of those with lived experiences, but then it becomes a bit tokenistic and kind of taking the approach as just when we want, we're going, or when it fits our own, agenda. But it should be a bit disruptive. It should be more like really collaborative and accepting that if we have people with different perspectives coming in, and people who were hurt and so disappointed in the system and frustrated, it's going to be disruptive. It's going to be like tough conversations, but that's going to lead to something that is much more meaningful, potentially. So it's to accept that there will be those moments of we're together with different perspectives, and sometimes it will kind of not be easy. But in the end, to have something that emerges out that is much more relevant and significant to make real changes in this process. So that would be kind of my advice in terms of how everything should be set up in that way, and not to think it's going to be an easy process. Otherwise, it means that we're not making real changes.
Love it, right? With discomfort, and I vote to have Delphine in the room. Right? Helping us feel okay with the discomfort of the difficult conversations. Love that. And to Erin's point that, the name abuse-free sport, and with compassion, we just kind of think we're experts and we trundle along and then bring people in, and shaking that up is really important as well. Not making assumptions or assuming power all the time. And thank you to everyone who is contributing to the chat. I mean, it's important. Let's put a little bit of attention over there, because I feel like, we're kind of split. We're having a conversation, but we're also listening. And I invite, if someone would like to turn their mic on and say their piece, that's okay too, because I think then we're giving a little more focused attention to some of the concerns here.
Maybe I can try to just answer quickly to Harv Davis, which is in terms of, and again, I'm really not familiar with the internal process, but if a person from any other field is being told that there is there's potentially an abusive situation happening, it's not necessarily the person receiving the disclosure to have to really ask those difficult questions to see if it's accurate. So I don't know how it came about, in the sports sector, and I'm again not really familiar with that. But it's the opposite that when we're kind of providing training on how to receive a disclosure. It's not to ask too many questions. It's to direct people to the authorities so they can give a proper kind of really reporting that will be recorded by a professional conducting interviews that are non-suggestive, that are with non-leading questions, to get to something that is very solid that can be brought forward in court. And police officers, child protection workers are trained to use those tools so that they don't ask leading questions that can really interfere with the memory capacities of victims. If you're being told, was he wearing a black t-shirt? Like suddenly there's a black t-shirt in your mind. And so then it might just become a bit blurry in terms of the reality and those leading questions that are just blending. So I would certainly recommend, and I don't know the process again, that there's a tendency to avoid going through that, that route of questioning the victim to assess whether there's some veracity or accuracy in the disclosure, and to refer the person directly to the authorities so that can be done properly. These trained people will be able to assess for accuracy. I understand that this is a concern, but there's some people who are really trained to do that in a way that won't do harm to the victim or to the alleged perpetrator as well. So
Right.
I don't know, and I don't know, an investigator, not who the original disclosure was made. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I thought it was really from kind of the person receiving it. And maybe now you're talking about more the internal investigator. And this is the piece that we would not recommend to have in a school setting, for instance. So the sports sector is taking a direction that is certainly not the one that is recommended in other sectors. So it would be interesting to explore why it was chosen and the pros and cons maybe of both models.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what could be added, what kind of supports could be added to support the victim as they go through the process, and the different processes being used in different sectors and the importance that sectors are talking. So I'm so glad to have you here as well. Erin, comments on prevention, other things that you would like to see in place that could help us prevent, education, of course. What kinds of education? What have you seen working? I know there's some real great modules out there right now and approaches.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question because there's so many things that need to happen. And I think we can kind of look at it from all different levels. So we have coach athlete, the relationship with the coach athlete. So making sure that we are in using more positive coaching techniques that have shown to work in a lot of research. So education on that, and just more understanding of what good looks like and how it can be used to better performance. I think we also need to think about the club culture and the environment that our athletes are living in and sport participants are living in. So ensuring that club policies are up to date, ensuring that even within a grassroots club, there is someone that people can talk to, that athletes know their rights, that athletes know what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, and that the parents are involved in those conversations, and the whoever is involved in the club level is making sure that there is a set of environmental policies that are available. So making sure that the club has their own code of conduct and that is being upheld. Particularly, we've seen a lot of coaches who are achieving success have a little bit more leniency towards their behaviors because there is a belief that those behaviors are leading to performance. So making sure that behavioral code of conducts are important no matter the results that are being achieved. I think background checks are also important, both criminal and non-criminal. So again, there's a lot of things that don't show up in a criminal background check, but making sure that there's references and from different, so if like a coach is moving clubs, for example, we see this a lot of times where a coach is dismissed from one club because of their conduct, but that's never moved over to another club because those things aren't seen. So making sure you're talking to athletes and other coaches and parents involved in club administrators. I think from a level above that, we have again, enforced code of conduct that is available and accessible and understandable. I think we also need to understand where our funding is coming from and what's being rewarded. So it's not really everyone's fault if there is a win at all cost mentality that everyone's going to try to win above being healthy. And if all we're doing is funding high performance and funding results in an own the podium model, it really makes it hard to change a coach's behavior. So understanding all of the levels that are involved in prevention and intervention and solving this problem, culture goes way beyond one person's behaviors and understanding all those levels. And it's very complicated, but I think my short answer is everyone needs to be involved in the change. Everyone needs to be recognizing that whether you're seeing it or you're not seeing it's probably unfortunately happening. And so just asking yourself in whatever role you're in, what can you do? What can you affect? What can you change? And what can we do to move forward and talk about prevention instead of just worrying about protecting everyone and protecting yourself.
That really circles back to Delphine's comment at the beginning about we're all responsible. And so being responsible to educate yourself. If you're feeling a little unsure as a coach, well, go figure out how to coach in a way that isn't going to be harmful in any way, and really understand those principles, dig it down and do that searching. Resources does come up. I know I hear lots from small clubs talking about how do we do it all, and I do see that as a huge gap. I know Katie Meisner's doing lots around that, right? How do we equip? Who leads it? Does it come from Sport Canada? On the podium have been blamed for causing a lot of the issues because of that focus on medals. How do they shift, and how do they then, take up some of the burden of, and I think they're trying around culture, but with that name up there, it's pretty tough to like you say, challenge behaviors that actually feed into owning the podium, right? So what's making us afraid to change names and change language? And it's very, very interesting. It all comes back to culture, I think, as well. Culture is artifacts, it takes shape, concrete artifacts like policies, behaviors, naming, where we direct our funding, rewards, investments, and that needs to reflect a set of values that I think we're all talking about and coalescing around. Harv had some points, and I'd like to finish off bringing Harv in if he's willing, because I think Harv brings up this point of bystanders as well. And and I know Sheldon Kennedy's focusing on bystanders a lot with the work that he's doing as kind of this real crux of the issue. How do we equip people to then support victims? Hey, that's another piece to the puzzle. So Harv, go ahead, maybe share your experience.
Firstly, thanks so much for all of you sharing your expertise and your experience. It's really informative, but I think you hit it on the head, the bystanders. So when you talk from a preventative point of view, I think part of it is educating everybody as a teammate and as a parent of the athlete. So when that call does come, when an abused athlete has come forward and there is a genuine concern, that's the worst case scenario. Preventative is obviously preferential, but now you have a concern and you want to be able to investigate it fully so that it does have an impact. And if there is somebody that needs to be held accountable, that's what you want, excuse me, as the end result. But when you phone the parents of the teammates of the victim, and they have all those same concerns, is this going to negatively impact my child's relationship with their coach? And so they opt out. They don't want to participate. And, we can all understand those reasons why you wouldn't want to negatively impact your child. But we do at this point have somebody that's come forward, and without corroboration of some sort, it may not come up with the result that it deserves.
And so thoughts on that? How do we help people be less, well, it's that fear of repercussion, right? Being blacklisted. I think many of us have seen it, witnessed it, experienced it, been disinvited. Yeah. What do you think?
There's it's difficult for whistleblowers and people who are speaking up on behalf of others and to feel that they're protected, and they might really fear for very good reasons, repercussions. So I think it's very important for any institution to be very clear to what extent things can be kept confidential. And so to encourage people to come forward with some elements that can be kept confidential, but also to be supportive of those who are just kind of also sharing this information. I think that there's a great deal of focus on the victims, rightfully so. Or we can have also a great deal of attention to the perpetrators, because he's part of that, or she's part of that organization. It was pointed out as an example with both a male and female perpetrators. I think it's very important as well to recognize that. But it's how we support the entire community as well. Because the person who had to corroborate, or the witness of a situation, might be in a great need of support as well. And maybe the entire community, like the organization, the people being part of that organization, even if you don't know that coach in particular, or that coach is not your child's coach, it as a parent, it might impact you to have an abusive situation happening in your sport organization, and your trust might be shaken. Maybe there's something at least that will happen. It's not any kind of, experience. So I would say that we need to bring it at a community level. How can we take care of all of us in this situation with, again, a great deal more focus on the victim, but to everyone else that is part of that community, if we want to help people reconnect with that organization and for the trust to be rebuilt.
Truth and reconciliation, really, right? That discomfort with truth, but helping people understand that we're all in this together. We're all going to learn together. I really see a lot of organizational leaders tipping into that fear, and then they feel complicit, they're afraid, and so now they protect instead of being open to the learning and let's resolve and restore. And that's it really just comes back to what you just said, Delphine, that we're all in this together. We're a community. Let's try to be compassionate, wrap our arms around each other. And thank you to Harv for sharing his insights, and everyone in the chat, everyone for attending. Any last words, Erin, before we part?
No, I think this has been a really important conversation to have. There's a lot of conversations to be had, and I think just thank you for facilitating this. It's a big problem, and there's a lot that needs to change to be able to make it safe. But I think I also see a little bit more hope than I think we've seen in the past. I think we all are here because we believe sport has the potential to be good, and there's a lot of good that comes to sport, from sport. And I do, as much as I can critique sport, I do acknowledge, like, I had so many great coaches, one of whom is on this call today. I had so many great experiences with sport, and there's so much good that needs to be done. So if we can just keep fostering that good while understanding the realities of sport. But I think having conversations like these and bringing in all people and all coaches, athletes, sport administrators, bystanders, like, everyone needs to be part of these conversations. So thanks for facilitating a webinar where we can have these tough conversations.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Delphine, for your insights, your experience, and your passion. We'll just keep working together, and I'll keep trying to facilitate more conversations and push for others outside of this. Obviously, this is just one little platform, but there are so many others, and I'll see you both, I'm sure, soon. Take care, everyone, and thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. We'll be sending out information about the next session shortly, but please feedback as well and share your topics that you would like us to examine. I'm all ears.